Whispers of the Fortress. Dr. Eleanor Ellie Cartwright had always felt at home among the ruins of the past. An archaeologist by trade and a seeker of shadows by nature, she was not content with merely brushing dirt from ancient artifacts. For Ellie, history was alive, a breathing entity that pulsed beneath the surface of stone walls and weathered battlements. It whispered to her, called her to uncover its buried secrets, no matter how dark or dangerous. Edinburgh Castle was no exception. Perched high above the city like a crown of menace, its blackened stones bore the weight of centuries of bloodshed, betrayal, and unspeakable suffering. Ellie had studied it for years in dusty libraries and musty archives, poring over its storied past. A fortress, a royal residence, a dungeon. It had been many things to many people. But to Ellie, it was something else entirely, a puzzle. A puzzle that begged to be solved. Ellie's obsession began when she was a child, listening to her Scottish grandmother's tales of the castle's ghosts. There was the headless drummer boy, whose rhythmic warning foretold disaster. The spectral piper, lost in the tunnels beneath the castle, his mournful tune said to echo through the stone. And the countless prisoners who had died in agony, their restless spirits rumored to wander the fortress to this day. As she stood before the massive gates of Edinburgh Castle, Ellie couldn't help but feel the weight of those stories pressing down on her. This trip wasn't just another research expedition, it was personal. The castle had called to her, and she had answered. Ellie wasn't alone in her endeavor. Accompanying her was Callum McRae, a young historian with a sharp tongue and an even sharper sense of skepticism. While Ellie chased the ghosts of the past, Callum was there to tether her to reality. Or so he thought. His expertise lay in debunking myths and unraveling the factual history hidden beneath layers of folklore. To him, the castle was nothing more than an imposing monument to human cruelty, not a hotbed of paranormal activity. But as they crossed the threshold into the castle's inner sanctum, even Callum couldn't deny the oppressive atmosphere. The air seemed thicker here, the shadows deeper, the silence unnervingly loud. Ellie felt a shiver crawl up her spine, though whether it was from the chill of the Scottish wind or the castle's infamous aura, she couldn't say. There was something here, something watching, waiting. She had felt it in other places before, an ancient energy that defied logic and begged to be understood. Her hand tightened around the strap of her satchel, filled with notebooks, maps, and old journal entries, tools of her trade, and her shield against the unknown. As the sunlight began to wane, casting the castle in shades of gray and black, Ellie knew one thing for certain. The fortress had stood unyielding for centuries, but it had never faced her. Sentinel of shadows, Edinburgh Castle loomed over the city like a silent sentinel, its silhouette jagged and stark against the pale sky. The craggy outcrop of Castle Rock thrust the fortress skyward, as though it had been summoned by some ancient force to guard the land below. Every stone in its blackened walls bore the scars of history, scorched by fire, stained with blood, and worn smooth by the ceaseless battering of wind and rain. From this vantage point, Ellie could see the life of Edinburgh unfolding far below. Cobblestone streets twisted and turned like veins through the old town, bustling with tourists and locals who moved through their routines unaware of the shadows that loomed over them. She thought of the stories she'd read, how enemies had once looked up at these same walls, their minds filled with dread at the castle's impregnable defenses. But it wasn't just its military might that made the fortress unassailable. Something darker seemed to cling to its stones, a malevolence that had seeped into its foundations over the centuries. The air grew colder the closer she approached the gates. Ellie had read about this phenomenon, a phenomenon skeptics dismissed as mere suggestion or microclimates. But here, in the castle's long shadow, it felt alive. The castle didn't just dominate the landscape, it seemed to draw the light from the world around it. Even the seagulls that wheeled overhead avoided the towers, their cries muffled as if swallowed by the thick air surrounding the battlements. The castle's presence was inescapable. From its towering curtain walls to the sheer drop of the cliffs below, it demanded reverence and repelled intimacy. It was as though it knew its visitors came with questions, and it had no intention of answering. Ellie felt the weight of that defiance as she passed beneath the portcullis gate, its iron teeth frozen in mid-bite. She paused for a moment, taking in the vastness of the courtyard beyond. Here, the ground was uneven, cobbled together like the fragments of a memory, a patchwork of time where soldiers had marched, traitors had been dragged, and innocence had screamed. Above her, the battlements jutted outward like jagged teeth. The castle keep, the oldest part of the fortress, rose in the distance, its dark windows like empty eyes peering out over the city. Somewhere deep within those walls, Ellie knew, were the tunnels, the ancient, twisting passageways where legends whispered of ghostly pipers and hidden treasure. It was both magnificent and terrifying, a monument to Scotland's resilience and its darkest tragedies. But as Ellie stood in the middle of the courtyard, the imposing beauty of the castle gave way to a creeping unease. It felt as though she were being watched, not by tourists or the occasional guide, but by something unseen, something older than the stones themselves. The wind shifted, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and something metallic. Blood. Ellie tightened her scarf against the chill, though it offered little comfort. She glanced at Callum, who stood nearby, oblivious to the tension curling around them like fog. For Ellie, this was more than just a historical site. It was a crucible, a place where the past and present collided, and where she would begin unraveling the mysteries that had haunted her for years. The fortress stood unyielding, but Ellie couldn't help but wonder, how much of its strength came from the living, and how much from the dead, driven by shadows. For Ellie, coming to Edinburgh Castle was more than a professional endeavor. It was an obsession born from fragments of a story she could never fully piece together. As a child, her grandmother had spoken of the castle not as a relic of history, but as a living entity, an ever-watchful presence that carried the weight of ancient secrets. It wasn't just the tales of ghostly drummers and spectral pipers that fascinated Ellie. There was something deeper, more personal. The story of the Langmores, an old and obscure line in her family tree. Her grandmother had claimed the Langmores were tied to the castle's past, but the details were always elusive, slipping through the cracks of conversation like sand through fingers. What Ellie did know was tantalizing and troubling. They had been keepers of something, a relic, a treasure, or perhaps a curse. Ellie had discovered a name in an old journal while researching in the University of Edinburgh's library. Honora Langmore, a woman accused of witchcraft in the late 16th century and rumored to have vanished within the castle walls. The journal hinted at an object hidden deep within the castle, an artifact that Honora had allegedly smuggled to safety before her disappearance. The artifact was described only in cryptic terms: the stone's curse, carved by the hand of wrath, forged in the fire of betrayal. What did it mean? Ellie had spent years chasing vague allusions in texts and archives, finding references to the stone buried within esoteric footnotes, but nothing concrete. Now, as she stood in the castle courtyard, Ellie could feel the pull of something old and powerful. She was certain that Honora's artifact existed, and that it was somewhere within these walls. If it did, it could unlock not only a hidden piece of her family's history, but also explain the castle's centuries of turmoil and tragedy. Callum had rolled his eyes when she shared her theory, calling it a glorified ghost story. But Ellie didn't need him to believe. She believed enough for both of them. Her motivations weren't entirely academic, though she told herself otherwise. If there was a chance, however small, that uncovering the truth about the Langmores and their artifact could provide answers to the castle's dark reputation, she had to pursue it. And if those answers unearthed something otherworldly, even better. Ellie had spent her career debunking myths and chasing mysteries, earning herself a reputation as a fearless scholar willing to tread where others wouldn't. Yet standing here, with the castle towering above her, she felt the first flicker of doubt. There were those who had warned her to leave the past buried, academics, locals, even Fergus, the grizzled groundskeeper who had all but spat at her when she mentioned her research. "Langmore," he'd said, narrowing his eyes. "You don't want to go digging that name up. Some stones aren't meant to be turned over." His words haunted her as she adjusted her satchel and steeled herself. Ellie wasn't afraid of legends. She wasn't afraid of curses. But standing beneath the castle's shadow, with the air pressing heavy and cold around her. She couldn't shake the feeling that this time, the legends might be afraid of her, and that made her more determined than ever. Whispers in the stone. As Ellie stepped further into the castle's courtyard, the air seemed to shift, growing heavier with each passing moment. The low hum of tourists milling about faded into the background, muffled as though the ancient stones were swallowing sound itself. It wasn't an absence of noise, but a strange distortion, like listening to the world through water. She brushed it off at first, attributing it to jet lag or her own anticipation. But then there was the cold. The temperature dropped suddenly, though the sun still hung bright and clear in the sky. Ellie paused and adjusted her scarf, glancing at Callum, who was scanning the courtyard with an air of detached curiosity. He didn't seem to notice the chill, or if he did, he wasn't showing it. Yet it felt unnatural, as though the castle itself was breathing cold air onto her skin. Then came the sense of being watched. Ellie had grown used to this feeling over the years, whether it was in long-abandoned tombs or at historical dig sites where curious locals loitered at the edges. But this was different. There was an intensity to it, like unseen eyes boring into her from every angle. She glanced around the courtyard, scanning the battlements and open windows above. Nothing. Yet the feeling persisted. Her pulse quickened, and she had to resist the urge to look over her shoulder. Her logical mind wrestled for control. This was a castle, an old, imposing one, full of shadows and drafts. It was easy to let the imagination fill in the blanks. She had studied enough cases of collective hysteria and overactive fear to know better. Still, the sensation clung to her. Ellie pressed on, determined not to let her unease derail her mission. But as she neared the steps leading toward the castle keep, a faint sound stopped her in her tracks. It was rhythmic, soft, and almost imperceptible at first, a distant, hollow tapping that seemed to echo through the stones. She strained to locate the source, but it was everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind like a distant memory. Drums. The sound was unmistakable now. It was slow and steady, growing louder as if marching closer. Ellie turned to Callum, who was a few steps ahead. He hadn't noticed the sound, or if he had, he wasn't reacting to it. She opened her mouth to say something, but the sound suddenly stopped. Her breath caught, and a tingling sensation crept along the back of her neck. The silence that followed was thick, pressing down on her like the castle's weight above. She clenched her fists, forcing herself to focus. It was just her imagination. It had to be. But then she caught something out of the corner of her eye, a fleeting movement at the edge of her vision. She turned sharply, expecting to see a person or perhaps one of the many crows that often perched on the battlements. Nothing. The spot where she thought she saw movement, a narrow slit of a window high on the keep, was empty. The shadows within were so deep they seemed to ripple, but there was nothing there. Ellie? Callum's voice broke through her reverie, and she realized he was staring at her, his brow furrowed. She forced a laugh, hoping to dispel her rising unease. "Just soaking it all in," she said, her voice lighter than she felt. But as she followed Callum toward the keep, she couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes watching her every step. And far above them, in the narrow window, the shadows shifted once more.
And that's why we're living, fucking hoping for one if you're driving.